On the morning of May 31st, 1889, the town of Johnstown was already familiar with rising water. Rain had been falling through the night, steady, unremarkable, easy to ignore. Shops opened, church bells rang, and life continued as it always had. 16 kilometers upstream, a dam was quietly reaching its limit. No engineers were on site. The warnings were uncertain, and the decisions were delayed. Down in the valley, no one could see what was forming above them. There was still time to act. The problem was, no one agreed on how serious the danger really was. This is the story of the Johnstown Flood. Long before the flood, Johnstown existed because of water. The town sat deep in a narrow valley in western Pennsylvania, where rivers met industry and geography dictated daily life. The Conemaugh River ran straight through the center of town, joined by smaller streams that carried meltwater from the surrounding hills. For decades, these waterways powered mills, cooled furnaces, and made Johnstown one of the most productive steel towns in the United States. Water was not an abstract force here. It was part of work, part of survival, part of routine. People measured seasons by river levels and rainfall, and most residents believed they understood its behavior. Flooding was not unknown, but it was familiar. The river rose, the river fell, and life adjusted accordingly. This familiarity would later prove dangerous. By the late 19th century, Johnstown was a growing industrial town of more than 30,000 people. Steel mills ran day and night, drawing workers from across Europe. Entire neighborhoods were built close to the riverbanks, because that was where the factories were, and that was where jobs existed. Homes, boarding houses, churches, and shops filled every flat stretch of land the valley allowed. There was little room to expand outward, so the town expanded inward and upward, stacking itself tightly along the water. At the time, this made sense. Rivers were lifelines, not threats. And yet, the geography that made Johnstown prosperous also made it vulnerable. The valley narrowed sharply upstream, forming a natural funnel. Any large volume of water entering that space would have nowhere to spread out. It would accelerate, compress, and move forward with force. Few residents thought about this in abstract terms. It was simply the shape of home. Upstream from Johnstown, beyond a series of hills, sat an old structure most people in town rarely mentioned. It had been built decades earlier, long before steel mills dominated the valley. Originally constructed as part of a canal system, the South Fork Dam was designed to hold backwater for transportation, not protection. Over time, the canal system was abandoned, but the dam remained. Eventually, the reservoir behind it became a private lake, owned by the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Its members were among the wealthiest industrialists in the country. To them, the lake was a retreat, a place for fishing, boating, and escape from industrial cities. For the people of Johnstown, the dam was distant, almost theoretical. It sat miles away, out of sight and out of mind. Most residents knew it existed, but few had reason to think about its condition. It had been there for years. It always had been. That alone created a sense of safety. Over time, subtle changes were made to the dam. Its spillway was modified. The crest was lowered slightly to accommodate a roadway. Debris screens were installed to keep fish from escaping the lake. None of these decisions seemed dramatic on their own. Each change had a practical justification. And yet, taken together, they altered how the dam behaved under stress. This was not widely discussed in Johnstown, and in fairness, most people had no access to that information anyway. Engineering was not transparent, and safety regulations were minimal. Responsibility was fragmented. No single authority was tasked with protecting the towns downstream. Instead, trust filled the gaps. Trust in distance. Trust in time. Trust that nothing serious had happened before. As spring turned into early summer in 1889, the weather became unsettled. Heavy rains swept across the region, saturating the ground and swelling streams. This alone was not alarming. Johnstown had seen wet seasons before, but there was something different about the persistence of the rain. It did not arrive as a single storm and pass. It lingered. The soil absorbed what it could, then stopped absorbing altogether. Water began running across the surface, feeding creeks, then rivers. Upstream, the reservoir behind the dam rose higher than usual. Still, life in Johnstown continued. Steel production did not slow. Trains arrived on schedule. Children walked to school. Store owners unlocked their doors each morning. If anyone noticed the river rising faster than usual, it was filed away as a passing concern. After all, the river had risen before, and it had always gone back down. What people did not realize was how dependent their safety had become on a structure they did not control, maintained by people they would never meet. The town's relationship with water had always been transactional. It powered industry, supported growth, and occasionally caused inconvenience. It had never demanded accountability. That assumption shaped how people interpreted warning signs. A rising river was not an emergency. It was a condition, something to watch, not something to flee. In hindsight, this mindset feels fragile, but at the time, it felt rational. Experience had taught the town what to expect, and nothing in recent memory suggested that experience was incomplete. What no one in Johnstown could see was how multiple small factors were aligning upstream. Rainfall, design limitations, maintenance decisions, and human confidence were converging quietly. There was no single moment when disaster became inevitable. Instead, there was a gradual narrowing of outcomes, unnoticed by those most at risk. The river continued to rise. The rain continued to fall, and the dam continued to hold, just enough to maintain the illusion that it always would. The question was not whether water would move downstream. It always did. The question was whether anything stood in its way anymore. At the time, that question felt distant, almost academic. Very soon, it would become impossible to ignore. Long before it became a threat, the South Fork Dam was simply infrastructure. It was built in the early 1850s, not to protect towns downstream, but to serve the Pennsylvania Main Line Canal. Its purpose was practical and limited, to hold water at a stable level so boats could move goods across the state. When railroads replaced canals, the system was abandoned, but the dam remained. Over time, it shifted from public utility to private asset, changing not only ownership, but responsibility. By the late 19th century, the dam no longer answered to engineers employed by the state. It answered to a private club. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club purchased the reservoir and surrounding land as a retreat for some of the most powerful industrialists in America. For its members, the lake was a place of leisure, not risk. Fishing lines, sailboats, and summer gatherings replaced concerns about spillways and water pressure. The dam, once a functional barrier, became a backdrop. This shift mattered more than anyone realized at the time. When the club acquired the dam, it inherited a structure already compromised by age. Repairs were made, but they were guided by convenience rather than engineering rigor. The original spillway, designed to release excess water safely, had been altered and narrowed. Screens were installed to prevent fish from escaping the lake, reducing the flow capacity even further. The crest of the dam was lowered slightly to accommodate a carriage road. Each modification seemed minor. None were intended to weaken the structure, but together, they reduced the dam's ability to respond to extreme conditions. There were no formal inspections, no stress tests, no clear documentation of what the dam could withstand. At the time, this was not unusual. Engineering standards were still developing, and private ownership often meant private judgment. The assumption was simple: the dam had held before, so it would hold again. Downstream, Johnstown continued to grow, unaware of how much its safety depended on that assumption. The distance between the town and the dam created a psychological buffer. 16 kilometers felt far enough to separate cause from consequence. The dam was out of sight, and therefore out of mind. Few residents ever visited it. Fewer still understood its condition. Information traveled slowly, and concern traveled even slower. The people who lived below the dam trusted that someone, somewhere, was paying attention. The truth was more complicated. Responsibility was diffuse. The club saw the dam as a recreational feature, not a public safety device. The state had stepped away decades earlier. No single entity felt fully accountable for what might happen if the dam failed. This gap was filled by optimism and habit. After all, the dam had endured heavy rains before. It had survived winters, thaws, and storms. History, however, can be misleading when conditions change gradually. As the years passed, sediment accumulated in the reservoir, reducing its capacity. Maintenance remained informal. Repairs addressed visible issues, but rarely underlying limitations. When water levels rose, they were noted, but rarely treated as urgent. The system relied on judgment rather than protocol. In theory, the dam could release excess water through its spillway. In practice, that spillway had become increasingly inadequate. This fact was known to some engineers in the region. There were warnings, written and verbal, suggesting that the dam needed reinforcement or redesign. But warnings without authority are easy to dismiss. They competed with confidence, with cost concerns, and with the belief that catastrophic failure was unlikely. The club's members were influential, respected, and accustomed to control. The idea that their retreat could endanger an entire town below was uncomfortable, and discomfort rarely drives decisive action. As spring of 1889 approached, rainfall patterns began to shift. Snowmelt combined with repeated storms, feeding streams that flowed into the reservoir. Water levels rose steadily, then sharply. By late May, the lake was higher than it had been in years. Observers near the dam noticed changes. The water pressed against the crest. Debris gathered near the spillway. Small leaks appeared, then disappeared. None of these signs alone demanded panic. Together, they formed a pattern that required interpretation. An interpretation depends on mindset. Those managing the dam believed they had time. They believed that conditions, while unusual, were still manageable. There was confidence in experience, even though that experience was based on a different version of the dam under different circumstances. The structure had changed. The environment had changed. But the mental model had not. Downstream, Johnstown saw only the river. It was rising, but not yet alarming. Life continued as normal. No alarms were sounded. No evacuation plans were discussed. The dam above the valley remained a silent actor, exerting control without visibility. This separation between cause and effect created a dangerous calm. It allowed critical decisions to be delayed. It allowed uncertainty to persist. At any moment, decisive action might have altered the outcome, lowering the water level, reinforcing weak points, issuing clear warnings. None of these steps were impossible. The barrier was not technical capability. It was perception. The dam was not seen as an immediate threat, only a distant concern. And distance, in moments like these, can be deceptive. As the rain continued, pressure built quietly behind the earthen wall. The dam did not announce its limits. It did not signal when those limits were close. It simply absorbed stress, as it always had, giving no clear indication of how much more it could take. The people upstream believed they were managing a situation. The people downstream believed there was nothing to manage. Between those beliefs sat the dam, carrying the weight of both. The question was no longer whether the structure was imperfect. It was whether imperfection, combined with timing and weather, was enough to turn a private oversight into a public catastrophe. That question would not remain theoretical for much longer. By the final days of May 1889, warning signs were no longer isolated details. They were becoming a pattern. The rain had not stopped, and the ground across western Pennsylvania was fully saturated. Streams that usually ran quietly were now feeding larger waterways at an unusual pace. Upstream from Johnstown, the reservoir behind the South Fork Dam continued to rise, inch by inch, hour by hour. Observers near the dam could see that the water level was approaching the crest, a situation that demanded attention even under ideal conditions. These were not ideal conditions. Debris floated on the surface of the lake, carried in by swollen tributaries. Logs, branches, and vegetation drifted toward the spillway, collecting where water was supposed to escape. Some of this debris was cleared manually, but the work was slow and reactive. There was no systematic plan, only response. Those managing the dam believed they were addressing the problem as it emerged, not realizing how quickly the margin for error was shrinking. Messages began to travel downstream. Railroad operators, telegraph offices, and local officials exchanged information about rising water levels. In several communities between the dam and Johnstown, residents were advised to prepare for possible flooding. These warnings were cautious in tone, framed as precautions rather than urgent alarms. That distinction mattered. In Johnstown, similar messages arrived, but they were filtered through experience. The town had flooded before, and people had learned how to interpret warnings through that lens. A warning did not mean evacuation. It meant vigilance. It meant moving valuables upstairs, securing equipment, and watching the river. The idea that the source of danger might be the dam itself was rarely stated outright. There was an unspoken assumption that the structure above the valley was stable, even as evidence suggested otherwise. At the dam, the situation was becoming increasingly tense. Water began to flow over parts of the crest, something that was never intended to happen. Small leaks appeared on the downstream face, dark streaks where water pushed through the earthen wall. These leaks were not catastrophic on their own, but they were significant. In modern terms, they would have triggered immediate intervention. In 1889, they triggered debate. Some believed the dam could still hold if the rain slowed. Others worried that continued pressure would compromise the structure. The problem was not a lack of observation. It was a lack of authority. No one present had the power to order a controlled release of water large enough to reduce the reservoir significantly. No one had the mandate to evacuate towns downstream. Decisions were made collaboratively, cautiously, and slowly. Each hour of delay was justified by the hope that conditions would stabilize. This hope was reinforced by the absence of visible failure. By the morning of May 31st, 1889, the situation had crossed an invisible threshold. The rain had continued through the night, and by dawn it was clear that conditions were no longer stabilizing. They were worsening. At the South Fork Dam, the reservoir was now filled beyond levels anyone had previously recorded. Water pressed hard against the earthen wall, and the spillway struggled to carry away the excess. Debris returned as quickly as it was cleared. Logs jammed together, branches wedged themselves into gaps, and the flow became increasingly uneven. Those present at the dam worked continuously, aware that something was wrong but uncertain about what could still be done. There was no established emergency protocol to follow, only improvised decisions made under pressure. Attempts were made to lower the lake by digging channels along the crest, but the ground was already saturated. Each shovel of earth collapsed almost as quickly as it was removed. The dam absorbed the strain in silence. There was no single crack, no dramatic rupture, only subtle changes that required interpretation. Water seeped through new points along the downstream face. The leaks widened, then narrowed, then widened again. To some, this suggested the structure was adjusting, relieving pressure. To others, it suggested weakening. The difference between those interpretations mattered, because it shaped how much urgency people felt. As the hours passed, messages became more direct. Telegraphs were sent warning communities downstream that the dam might not hold. Trains were stopped or delayed as tracks near rivers began to disappear beneath rising water. In Johnstown, the river was now rising faster than anyone had seen before. Streets near the banks flooded. People moved furniture to upper floors. Some families sought higher ground, while others stayed, convinced this was simply another severe but manageable flood. There was no unified response, only individual judgment shaped by incomplete information. At the dam, confidence eroded. By early afternoon, water was flowing freely over sections of the crest. The spillway was no longer controlling the release. It was merely part of it. The structure had entered a state it was never designed to endure. Still, the dam held. Each passing minute reinforced the belief that it might continue to do so just a little longer. This belief was powerful. It delayed decisions that, in hindsight, appear obvious. No order was given to evacuate Johnstown. No final warning reached the people most at risk with enough clarity to change their actions. The physical distance between the dam and the town once again shaped perception. Those at the dam could see how close failure seemed. Those downstream could not. They saw only a rising river and assumed it would behave as it always had. Shortly after mid-afternoon, observers at the dam noticed a sudden drop in the water level near the crest. At first, this appeared encouraging, as if pressure were finally being relieved. But relief can be deceptive. In reality, the water was no longer rising because it was finding new paths through the structure itself. Internal erosion was accelerating, hidden from view. The dam was beginning to fail from within. There was no sound to announce this change. No visible collapse. Just a quiet shift in behavior that few recognized for what it was. Time was compressing, even as it felt suspended. The margin for intervention had disappeared, but the appearance of stability remained. In disasters like this, the final hours are often defined not by chaos, but by normalcy that lingers too long. People continued working. Messages continued to travel. The rain continued to fall, and the dam continued to stand, long enough to convince many that it still could. The last opportunity to change the outcome passed unnoticed, carried away by the same water that had made the valley prosperous in the first place. What remained was no longer a question of prevention, but of when the inevitable would finally reveal itself. The failure of the South Fork Dam did not announce itself with a sound that carried far. There was no explosion, no warning roar that reached Johnstown in time. The earthen wall gave way suddenly, releasing the entire reservoir in a single, irreversible moment. What had been contained for decades became motion. Millions of tons of water surged forward, accelerating as they dropped into the narrow valley below. The flood wave did not behave like a river overflowing its banks. It behaved like a moving wall, dense with debris, trees, railcars, sections of buildings, and fragments of the dam itself. As it rushed downstream, it gained speed and mass, consuming everything in its path. Small towns between the dam and Johnstown were struck first. In some places, residents had minutes to react. In others, they had seconds. Buildings were lifted from their foundations and carried away intact before breaking apart. Trains were thrown from tracks. Bridges vanished almost instantly. Telegraph lines went silent one by one, cutting off communication and leaving those ahead unaware of what was approaching. The water followed the shape of the valley, compressing and accelerating as it moved. By the time it reached the outskirts of Johnstown, it was traveling faster than any flood the town had ever experienced. In Johnstown, the river had already overflowed its banks. Streets were flooded, but the damage still appeared manageable. Many residents believed the worst had already arrived. Then the sound changed. Witnesses later described it as a deep, continuous rumble, unlike thunder and unlike wind. It grew louder, not gradually, but all at once. Those who looked upstream saw a dark mass filling the valley from side to side, moving toward them with impossible speed. There was no time to process what it was, only time to react. Some ran uphill, some climbed to rooftops, some froze, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with anything they had experienced before. The flood struck the town with overwhelming force. Entire neighborhoods were swept away in seconds. Buildings collided with one another, breaking apart and reforming into massive piles of debris that jammed against bridges and railroad embankments. Fires ignited within these wreckages, fed by trapped gas lines and fueled by wooden structures. Water and fire existed simultaneously, each making escape more difficult. The flood did not move through Johnstown and pass. It stopped there. The valley narrowed sharply at a stone railroad bridge, causing debris to accumulate into a temporary dam of its own. Water piled up behind it, rising higher and higher until it found new paths through streets and buildings. People trapped in this debris field clung to anything that held. Some survived for hours in pockets of air, waiting without knowing whether help could reach them. Others were carried under when the mass shifted again. As quickly as it arrived, the main surge began to lose momentum. The reservoir had emptied. What remained was standing water, wreckage, and silence broken only by cries and the crackle of fires. The town that had existed that morning was gone. In its place was a landscape reshaped beyond recognition. The water receded slowly, leaving behind layers of mud, debris, and loss that could not be measured immediately. For those who survived, the disaster did not feel sudden anymore. It felt complete. When the water finally stopped moving, what remained was not calm, but stillness of a different kind. The flood had exhausted its force, but it had not restored order. In Johnstown, the sound that followed was unfamiliar. There was no longer the rush of water or the roar of destruction, only scattered noises carried across a landscape that no longer resembled a town. Fires crackled within massive piles of debris. Smoke drifted slowly upward, mixing with mist and rain. Where streets had once been, there were channels of mud and wreckage. Where buildings had stood, there were fragments pressed together into shapes that defied recognition. Survivors emerged cautiously, unsure whether the danger had truly passed. Some climbed down from rooftops and upper floors, stepping into thick mud that hid sharp debris beneath the surface. Others called out names, listening for answers that often did not come. Communication was nearly impossible. Telegraph lines were gone. Rail lines were twisted or buried. Roads had ceased to exist. Johnstown was isolated, not only physically but psychologically. The scale of what had happened was difficult to comprehend. People searched for familiar landmarks to orient themselves and found none. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. The stone bridge that had briefly held back the flood now stood amid a massive accumulation of wreckage, a barrier of debris rather than water. Within it were homes, furniture, railcars, animals, and the remains of people who had not escaped. Fires burned there for days, fed by the sheer volume of material trapped together. Rescue efforts began immediately, but they were improvised and uneven. Those who could help did so without coordination, pulling survivors from debris, sharing food, and offering shelter where possible. Outside assistance was slow to arrive, not because of indifference, but because access was nearly impossible. When help did come, it arrived to a town stripped of its structure. Hospitals were destroyed. Supplies were scarce. The injured were treated wherever space could be found. As hours turned into days, the true human cost began to surface. Bodies were recovered from debris fields and riverbanks downstream. Many were never identified. Families searched for relatives with little information to guide them. Lists of survivors and missing were compiled and recompiled, changing daily as new discoveries were made. Grief settled unevenly, interrupted by the demands of survival. There was no single moment of mourning, only exhaustion layered with shock. The disaster had ended, but its presence remained everywhere. Mud coated everything it touched, marking how high the water had reached. The smell of smoke, decay, and wetwood lingered. For those who lived through it, the flood did not feel like a past event. It felt ongoing, embedded in every movement and decision. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the absence of what had once been familiar. And in that absence, Johnstown began to understand that recovery would not be measured in days or weeks, but in years, if it was possible at all. In the weeks that followed the flood, attention shifted from survival to explanation. The immediate question was simple: how could this have happened? The answer, however, was not. Investigations began almost immediately, led by journalists, engineers, and government officials attempting to trace the chain of events that had turned heavy rain into mass destruction. Evidence pointed consistently upstream. The failure of the South Fork Dam was not an unpredictable act of nature. It was the result of design limitations, poor maintenance, and decisions made without regard for those living below. Reports detailed how the spillway had been narrowed, how the crest had been lowered, and how warnings had gone unheeded. These findings were widely published and rarely disputed. What followed was not denial, but distance. Responsibility proved difficult to assign in a system where ownership was private and oversight was minimal. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club did not deny ownership of the dam, but it denied liability. Legal action was pursued by survivors and families of victims, yet the courts ultimately ruled that no individual or organization could be held responsible under existing law. The flood was classified as an act of God. This designation mattered. It transformed a sequence of human decisions into an unavoidable tragedy, removing accountability from those who had the power to prevent it. For many survivors, this ruling was as devastating as the flood itself. It suggested that loss on such a scale could occur without consequence, that negligence could exist without responsibility. And yet, the disaster did not pass without impact. Public reaction was strong and sustained. The Johnstown flood became a national story, shaping how Americans understood risk, infrastructure, and industrial power. Charitable aid arrived from across the country, coordinated in one of the first large-scale disaster relief efforts in U.S. history. More quietly, the flood influenced legal thinking. While Johnstown's victims did not see justice in their own time, the disaster contributed to the gradual development of liability standards that no longer required proof of negligence to assign responsibility. Strict liability laws would emerge in part because disasters like this exposed the limits of existing frameworks. The dam itself was never rebuilt. Its absence became a silent acknowledgement of failure. Johnstown, meanwhile, was rebuilt out of necessity rather than optimism. The town continued, but it did not forget. Memory lingered in physical markers, in stories passed between generations, and in an enduring awareness of what water, when mismanaged, can do. The flood ultimately left behind more than destruction. It left a lesson written not in theory, but in lived experience. That large systems fail not only when they break, but when responsibility dissolves. That distance between decision and consequence creates risk, and that disasters are rarely sudden. They are often the final moment in a long series of choices that felt reasonable at the time. The Johnstown flood did not end when the water receded. It continues wherever safety depends on assumptions, and where accountability is treated as optional. The question it leaves behind is not whether such a disaster could happen again, but whether we would recognize the warning signs before the silence returns.